So I went to India a long time ago now. It was February 2008. So things have changed quite a lot since. It's safe to say that India has been a rapidly changing country for a long time, and it's a very complicated continent. It is somewhere I have both struggled with and loved. When I went, I was 23. I was fairly new to development work. I'd just been starting at Christian Aid to get to grips with the different kinds of injustice around the world. And India blew my mind. Everything I thought I knew, I didn't. It's a complicated continent. It is a huge country, and any case studies I can give you can simply only represent those people. The poverty and wealth, the injustice and the extraordinary development and justice are so varied across the country that I can only share what I have seen and what I know. And I'm sure some of you may have travelled yourself and have your own stories to tell. So we went it'll be 13 years ago now. So I was but a child in February, and I love traveling. It's been my favorite thing so far, and the big loss of the last few years, partly with trying to be more aware of my carbon footprint, but also life has changed and now we're all locked down, is that I can't experience the cultures that I just loved. But I had this decade of travel, which I am so grateful for. And I've always been quite adventurous, and people in Kenya, Uganda, Colombia, India have always quite liked me visiting, because I will literally eat whatever they ask me to. I don't turn anything down, and they think that's brilliant because they're used to white English people being really fussy. But I am just give it a go, and I find if you can just throw yourself into these cultural experiences, you'll see so much more of people as they trust you, they see you trying to kind of meet them where they're at. So here's a picture of me drinking pure sugarcane. And I have a sweet tooth, but I tell you what, that was something. So I travelled around the northern part of India with a group of 8 from Christian Aid, similar jobs as me. We were all volunteer managers in different counties in the UK. And so we were simply going over to collect stories and to meet people where they were. To collect those kinds of case studies you see in your magazines, in Christian Aid magazines, Mothers Union ones, to find the pictures that will give an example of the wider picture. And we mostly went outside of Delhi to Rajasthan, right into the desert, and over to the Arc to where the Taj Mahal is, Agra, that area. So fairly rural, very different from the south of India. And New Delhi is a whole world of its own. So most of my stories come from very rural communities with projects that were primarily working with women. I want to start though by telling you about this group of women, because I actually went to go and visit them on my birthday 13 years ago. Now, I hadn't told anyone it was my birthday because I was going to be in India with a group of strangers. There were colleagues that I hadn't met before, but I thought, you know what? I don't need to make this about me. I will just have my little secret. It'll be my birthday, and I'll just be a memory to me. So I tried to be very humble about it, very unlike me. And as we arrived on that day to this wonderful project that worked with girls' education primarily, we were given the classic welcome, as you can imagine. Just they came out, they put everything aside for the day to meet us, to tell us about the work they'd been doing. And as we sat down in the main hall, and you can see it happen in real time on these photos, before we'd even had a chance to introduce ourselves, everyone stopped. And I looked at my colleagues, and they were looking particularly shifty. And I thought, what is going on here? And before I could panic, from the back of this big hall where there must have been 100 women sitting waiting to talk to us, came towards me a chocolate cake. And they put it down in front of me. You can see it on the picture there. And it said, "Happy birthday, Laura." And there had been this communication from all the way from Devon to Rajasthan in India, through the Christian Aid staff to this project in the middle of nowhere, to say, by the way, we've seen Laura's passport, it's her birthday while you're there. And they had made a deal, these complete strangers, all of them. And for the rest of the hour that we were there, we danced, and you can see me doing some very bad Bollywood style dancing. We had a party. I was a complete stranger, and they wanted to celebrate me simply because I was, because I existed, because I'd come to them, and they were there to give me that value and that worth. Once the party was over, and I was extremely overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers, we went off into the little villages and were seeing the work on the ground with women's education, with girls who have been given the skills to go to school, given textbooks, all the things that we know about happens when communities get together. And everywhere we went for the whole afternoon, at the end of the presentation, someone would say, and by the way, it's Laura's birthday. I think, oh no, it's not about me. I'm really trying to be better than I am. It's not about me. But nevertheless, they would jump up in whatever language they had, all the different dialects from Hindi onwards to English. They'd sing happy birthday, and someone would go and get me a present. And on one occasion, at the end of the day, a small girl ran off, came back and brought me a little bit of tapestry she'd made into a purse, and just handed it to me saying, many happy returns. And that was it. We got to the end of the day and we were debriefing, the 8 of us from the UK, that as we usually did. And I was uncharacteristically emotional as I replayed this day, which had supposed to been about, what was happening despite of me. And yet I'd been welcomed into these families and celebrated. And my colleague said to me, Laura, are you emotional because you're getting old? I said, no, but thanks. I said, I think what it is that this is the kingdom of heaven in action. I think I've just tasted what it's all about. That people are given their value and worth, even when they're strangers. What it is to be on the receiving end of that, when I was just hoping I'd be one of the good guys, white savior, go over there and be thanked a lot. Actually, I was shown value. And I realized as we talked that my job and my faith, being part of the church, meant that even when I left, the front lines of that kind of social justice and that kind of community spirit, when I left the dust and the dirt and came back to beautiful Devon, I'd still be part of that miracle. That's in being amongst people, and as my job was then and continues to be now, bumps into people of faith who will do the most extraordinary things for people they will never meet. That they will show the greatest value and worth to complete strangers, maybe not through birthday cakes, but through fundraising, through their prayers, through the ways people put themselves out without any expectation of being thanked. I realized that is what we are part of. The kingdom of heaven is like this. And so it stuck with me. I'll never have a birthday like it, but I was humbled. So the rest of the story, as I traveled around India and met some of these amazing people out into some of the poorest areas in the world. India has this paradox of some of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, economically stable communities and industries in the world, and some of the poorest on the doorstep. It is a complex country where the caste system very much perpetuates poverty. The caste system isn't necessarily a religious framework, although it can be wrapped up in religious beliefs, be they folk religion or Hinduism itself. But for the most part, it is simply a societal structure, a way of putting people in their place where people understand where they are in this world. And so if you're a Dalit, the lowest caste, the untouchables, you are the people who touch the unclean, the dead, you do the dirty jobs, and you are very much kept in your place. And people believe, and this is what I struggled at as someone in my early 20s who wanted to go and save the world, if only people would listen. was that sometimes people didn't believe they deserved better. That people believed because of reincarnation, or because of simply the accident of birth, the surname they had been given, which dictated where they were in the hierarchy, that's just how the world works. And so they got on with it. Not everyone realized they had any value. And I really struggled with that, because there is a big moral issue in social justice and development work in not imposing Western values on the worthy poor, not bringing all the things that we value into a different culture, but actually celebrating the diversity of how people live, while trying to grapple with what is universal injustice. I don't have simple answers to that, but it is something to always be aware of. Just because we live a more comfortable life than people we see on TV doesn't mean we're any better in so many ways, or that they want what we've got. And increasingly, particularly in East Africa, when I was in Kenya, the number of people who say, you know, we see the USA, we see the UK, we don't want to be like you. They think we're materialistic and morally bankrupt. So, you know, there's a lot of humility. And when we go even to the poorest areas, what do they have that we don't? And what do we have to share? And I think God's love is the most universal thing I've found to this date. So I'm going to tell you a rather harrowing story. I'm going to keep it fairly trigger warning light. It's not a comfortable story, and there are details I won't tell you, but you'll pick up on them. But it's one that for these 13 years still gets me. This is Ramesh. He came to a project called Sakikenja in Agra, as we were hearing these stories of people who've been helped by this organization, who offer financial and legal aid to those people, particularly women, who are undergoing usually divorce situations, or want to hold to account those who've raped or abused them. So they work with the police, they work with lawyers, and they work with families to get justice for cases that otherwise would be swept under the carpet. Ramesh came in to tell us about his daughter, Vashna. Vashna had been a sparky young woman, played hockey, top of her class, went to university and studied law, and she got her degree. She then, in her early 20s, got married to a young man who worked for the government. His job would take him from area to area, and each time they moved, they need to refurbish their house. And Vashna would come to her dad, to Ramesh, and say, actually, can we borrow some more money? Can we have some more of my dowry? And I need money to set up my new life. And as the years passed, Ramesh says, he felt like when his daughter came and asked for money, there was a sense of desperation, that without the money, his daughter might just be in trouble, that the money would keep life at home peaceful. So he gave as much as he could to make sure that the money bought whatever it needed to buy, or indeed went into the husband's pocket to give him whatever lifestyle he demanded to have. Vashna had 2 daughters. Her husband wasn't particularly pleased with this. He was keen for sons, and she wanted to stop at 2 children. She wanted to one day go back to work, and she wanted her 2 daughters to go to school. Her husband wasn't up for this particularly. Sadly, one of her daughters, in a rather mysterious accident, was playing on the roof of their flat house and fell off and was killed. To lose a 5 or 6-year-old is a devastating event in anyone's life, and Vashna was driven by her grief to push her husband to send her remaining daughter to school. She wanted her daughter to have the education she had been given, to have the career options she had been given. She wanted her daughter to fulfill her potential. But as the years passed and these tussles continued, the husband really stuck his heels into. Ramesh stopped hearing from Vashna after a few years. His granddaughter was about 10 by now, and he hadn't heard from Vashna for a couple of years. The next time he heard from her was from her brother, his son. Her brother had, for no real reason, gone round to Vashna's house and knocked on the door. Just felt the need to go over. When he got there, he found that Vashna was in the bathroom. Her husband and his brothers had run away, and he'd seen them run down the road. And Vashna was in the bathroom, having been strangled. The brother managed to untangle Vashna and take her to hospital. She had been suffocated, but had survived. And over the next few weeks, as Ramesh came to his daughter's bedside, they waited and they prayed, and Vashna did wake up, but she was left with considerable brain damage. When I met Ramesh, it had been about a year since this had happened. Vashna was living at home, but was paraplegic, could communicate really only with one arm and through her eyes and with a few words, but she needed full-time care from her parents, and his granddaughter was living with them. There was no backup in terms of finance, no NHS, no anything. He'd first come to Sakikenja, the project, to ask for help with medical bills because there was no way he could pay them out of pocket. He ran a shop, and so there was no pension for him to fall back on and not a lot of savings, but enough just to keep ticking over. But as the months went by and Vashna's medical bills crept up and they weren't going anywhere, and he also had to pay for his granddaughter's education, he got desperate. The whole case had been in the newspapers. He had been outraged, and Sakikenja and other charities had made it a big press issue. The injustice of this government employee who had fled, having abused his wife and not come back and not paid for medical care and abandoned his daughter. They had made it a media case, but the husband simply hadn't been caught. Sakikenja put a lot of pressure on the local police. They had a relationship, and the husband was brought in and he was given a warning. But as the police case was pending, the husband came and knocked on Ramesh's door and said, "I will give you money if you drop the police case." And Ramesh sat there and he said to me, "I considered taking it because I'm running out of money. What world is it that I have to consider taking a bribe from the man who hurt my daughter just to look after her?" And he said, as our conversation ended, he said, "I've come to tell you my story because no father should have to make that decision." He didn't take the money. He's a strong man, and I don't know where he is. He was in his 70s when I met him. He was carrying on working probably until his last days on earth. And Sakikenja were able to get him legal aid to prosecute the husband. He didn't get a jail sentence, from what I understand, but he was fired, and he's probably gone on to get another job and another family. But there was some justice there. He was at least held to some account. And Ramesh is being supported by various charities in his medical bills and in his granddaughter's education. He has accepted all the help on offer, and people have been incredibly generous. But his spirit is broken by the system, by the injustice of it, by having to fight for such a simple human right. So one of the most important jobs that Sakikenja and other organizations in India do is to build that relationship with the police, with the legal system, and with the political system. In India, there are many laws against domestic violence, rape, all kinds of gender-based discrimination. The caste system is technically illegal. So Dalits should never be prejudiced against. There should be no bias against you because of your caste. But it simply hasn't trickled down to that ground level, to that cultural change that needs to happen. And so projects like these work to make that ground level difference. Sakikenja often takes groups of young girls to the police station to talk to the police officers and to build a relationship so that when women feel like they are being abused or have to run away. They feel scared. They know that that's a safe place to come. The number of women police officers being recruited was slowly going up because they do want this systemic change to happen. It's a long, long game to play. I take you right out into the desert, into a place where no white people had been before, out into Rajasthan. I want to tell you a story on the other side of that coin, a story of hope, that change can happen even when traditions and this is the way it's always been gets in the way. Now, out in many parts of northern India, you see saris of all different colours covering the faces of women. So these aren't the particular women I'm talking about, but these are examples of them. You drive into a village compound out in the middle of nowhere, and you just see a sea of pink, orange, yellow veils over people's faces. It's the most glorious. If you think what they're showing you on the screen times 100 women, just a sea of colour, and you'd hear from behind these veils the sound of singing as they welcomed us into their village. One particular village, I say, had never seen white people before, but they had been working with a project for 5 years. They, 5 years previously, had come to this local community group who'd been working with Christian Aid and other funders to look at education, to look at the ways that farming could be adapted with the changing climate. They were just putting together action plans tailored to communities. And the elders of this village, the men, had come to the charity and said, we're really struggling. We as men have to go further and further away to do our farming, to take our livestock, or to go and get jobs to bring money into our community. Our old ways of living are not working. And the men of this village said, the one resource we are not using is our women. What do we do about that? Now, I think that's an incredibly brave step to say, empower our women, help us. That is countercultural and it's brave. And the men led the way on that. So this project had been invited into this community and worked with them on getting a well rejuvenated so they didn't have to walk so far. They had got a school built in walking distance. And I say walking distance, I mean an hour away, not 6 hours away. And they were starting to lobby for teachers that would be based in that school full time rather than sharing just 2 or 3 days a week. They had plans. They had plans for all sorts of things. And so as they told their stories, I thought, well, this is the story of hope, isn't it? This is a story of a community who have taken their own destiny, asked for help, and been in real partnership, and they're doing it themselves. This is empowerment. But as I looked to the community charity leaders, the women who had been working with this community for 5 years, I realized that they were looking a bit disappointed. And I said to them, but look, there's a group of 100 women sitting in front of me who previously would not have come out of their homes to meet a stranger, who had been tucked away in their huts and let the men do the talking. Here they are doing the talking. Now, what are you sad about? And she said to me, oh, I know all of that, but it's been 5 years. And you see these veils that they're wearing, they are barriers. There's no religious significance. They are purely a cultural sign that the women are to be hidden away. They are to keep them separate. They are not seen. Said, while they've got that cultural reminder that they are less, we haven't got quite as far as we hope we have. We've got all the trimmings of development, of success, but actually what we're looking for is them to know they're worth something. And I was hoping they wouldn't be wearing their veils today, Laura. But yeah, that's something I just wouldn't know if I didn't listen to the deeper stories. If I only wanted to look at the plaques on the wall and the wells built and the schools built, you'd miss the people behind the stories, the eyes behind the veils. But as we had this conversation, from the corner of my eye, I heard in the local dialect what I assume was 1, 2, 3, go. Because at that moment, 100 women took off their veils. And they had waited for that moment when those who'd worked with them and those they knew were part of their story somewhere down the line were there to witness the moment that they, as one voice, said, look at me, look me in the eye, here we are. And as they started to sing, the looks on their faces as they took that brave and bold step of saying, we know what we are worth, was what we're about. As people of faith, we are about seeing people and changing not only just the practical details of their lives, their health and the general things you can measure. What we do when we pray for people we don't know, when we fundraise, when we join in partnership with people saying, how can I work alongside you? Is we say we can see you, even when the world turns its back, even when the world wants to hide you away, because it's convenient for us to feel like we're the heroes. You are in it with us, and you are building your own path, and that's what we're capable of when the kingdom of heaven is realized. Wow. Quite extraordinary. And that's what's possible. Even in the corners of the world, you think, well, they'll never change. So as I come to an end, I want to play you a video of a different community. I want you to hear the voices of these women as they sing to welcome people like you and me into their space, into their story, into what they're doing to bring hope to. Much as I could listen to that all day. That particular village that you hear singing there, I mean, they're a little bit further down the line than the one with the veils. They had got their school, they got their well, and they started a domestic violence program. And the way it worked was that if they found that there was a husband misbehaving, their words, and hitting their wife, which was kind of commonplace, they decided this wasn't okay in their community anymore. So they had this committee of women. They were the domestic violence committee. And if they heard of a husband hitting their wife or misbehaving in any way, they would go round and have a word. Now, I don't know if you can imagine what 50 women turning up on your doorstep having a word looks like, but it turns out it's an extremely effective method of tackling domestic violence because they find that the men really have started behaving themselves. And I said to this lady in the red, I can't remember her name, but I remember her being the terrifying leader of this group, who were fighting for change at every level. I said to her, you know what, we have domestic violence in the UK. And we have gender injustice and gender violence, you know, behind hidden doors, just like you've done here. What advice can you give to me as someone who wants to fight? And she stood up and said, well, you tell them to stop or we'll come over there. And I thought, I bet you would as well. You know, they'd be on the first flight over. If I gave them names and addresses, you would have 50 women on your doorstep saying, you better stop that. It's so wonderful to see the spirit of empowerment, what people are capable of when they're just told that they can, when obstacles and barriers are taken away from people who are otherwise kept swept under the carpets, kept quiet, kept oppressed. You release people, tell them their worth, and transformation happens. So, I want to finish with something not from 13 years ago, from a few weeks ago. Because although, you know, my life's moved on since my time in India and traveling around the world, and we're now in this strange and unprecedented times. You had that on your bingo sheet, you can tick it off. We are in a world where we're wondering what comes next, what transformation is going to happen, what do we look forward to? And there are so many things, it feels like we're too tired to change, or what will it look like, or well, things have always been like this, for the church particularly. And I know for Mothers Union, there's this wrestle of how do we go into a new generation where things are so different? How do we rebuild what we've lost and continue? What do we take with us? And it feels like with church decline, with a country that is increasingly divided, with the impacts of the pandemic, where we simply don't know how broken we will be this time next year, there are some real challenges ahead. But I look back to those communities in India who, against the odds, managed to embrace a vision that they had to just put faith in. They couldn't see how, after generations of being one way, they could ever change, and yet they did. You can wear veils for thousands of years and one day stop wearing your veil because as a collective, you say, let's step forward a different way. I've seen that kind of transformation in all sorts of pockets of the world, and I believe and pray for it for us, that we will be that brave to step into a new way of being church, of being the kingdom of heaven in the here and now, even though we can't quite imagine it yet. So I want to turn finally to the words of Amanda Gorman, the poet who spoke at Joe Biden's inauguration and gave a profoundly moving poem. This is just a couple of excerpts which spoke powerfully to me, into what I'm considering, into my memories of people like Ramesh and to those women with their veils, and I hope to you as well. So I guess I pray this. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learnt that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just is isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours. Before we knew it, somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out to our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. This is the promise to glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare. Amen. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
In the wrong bit.
Thank you so much. That was
That
just
was lovely. That's great.
so inspiring. So
That really
inspiring.
was. It really was. It got to. Has anybody got a question to ask Laura? Do you know anything about these communities all these years on, whether they're, you know, still surviving? Do you know? I mean, you know, Christian Aid, do they still work with them in that area?
I believe so. When I last checked a few years ago, when I had access to the India office, sakikenja, certainly that main one, works with Ramesh, is a huge movement in that part of Agra, and is still supported by Christian Aid.
Yeah.
The specific villages, I have no way of finding out since I left 5 years ago, unfortunately. Certainly 5 years ago, they had come on leaps and bounds. And the way that these community initiatives work is that they will have a number of streams of funding. So even if Christian Aid will have to pull out, or they'd say, actually, we've started you off, we're going to go and put seed money elsewhere. The ideal in communities in countries like this is that they would start to get increasing funding and support from the Indian government. And so they are less and less dependent on international aid. And so the way Christian Aid and other NGOs work is usually with a 10-year plan to make people independent, either of themselves or within country, so that if international aid does become precarious, which unfortunately it has done, certainly in the last 13 years with a change of government, they are not left high and dry. So I have no doubt that those community projects will have found funding from all sorts of places, and particularly with the political changes in India and the commitments, particularly to gender equality, I hope they have flourished, even if Christian Aid has readjusted. It's a wonderful thing to be seeing in its pioneering days.
Yeah.
Maybe one day I'll even go back.
To see.
Yes.
It's fascinating to see it from when people are working there, isn't it? Because I know with MU, there's lots of projects that happen, but we don't always hear about them, do we? Or you know something started or money spent, but you never actually know how it develops and what happens at the end, do you? That is one of the problems, isn't it, really? But that was good. Anybody else?
Yeah, can I, observation really, I mean, the barriers in a country like India, whether it's North India or Southern India, the barriers that have to be overcome to achieve gender justice or gender equality or gender equity, whatever you want to call it. I mean, what you showed us is an insight into the enormous changes that need to take place. And I think it requires real faith and real courage, whether it's a religious faith or just faith in what you believe about humanity. Requires tremendous faith and courage to keep going in the face of the opposition that you get. That story about those women with veils, and you encouraged them, all of you encouraged them to take those veils off, I think is profound. And it's little candles like that being lit, isn't it? And little light bulb moments, and you know, tell the good news, spread that all around. This is what happened in whatever that village was, and it'll become infectious, won't it?
I think that's sometimes all we can hope to be, is people who push over a domino.
Yeah.
Or light the touch paper, or we're part of that in the middle. You know, we're often the person who's somewhat a beneficiary of that. Someone else's pushes over our domino. We get to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think when we're talking about real systemic change, the hardest sell, particularly when I was in the job, was saying you may not see the fruits of this, because real systemic change at cultural and structural level will take a generation.
Yeah.
So asking people to be part of something they will never get to see the end of is incredibly biblical.
Yes.
Very Moses. It's what the church has had to do, because it takes that long for everything to change. But it's not an easy sell. It's not easy sell for charities. You know, and that's so often why you get an ask for, if you do this, you know, A equals B and C, and aha, you can pat yourselves on the back. You've actually, we have to commit ourselves to something far more abstract and faithful and long term, if we are really keen about real change and not just a quick win.
Yeah. Can I
Changing minds, isn't it?
Yes.
Rather than minds and attitudes and culture, rather than just actually putting something practical in there. I mean, that's a start, but it's the cultural and the change of minds that's the important thing, isn't it?
It's both and, isn't it? It's the immediate need and the needs of the next generation to come.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you.
John?
Can I say something else, Janet?
Yeah, of course you can. Say what you like, John.
I think there's a lesson in that story for us in Mothers Union, because it's terribly easy for us in remote little old England, and Mothers Union is in 83, 84 countries, to think, well, the tiny little thing that I do, the tiny little contribution that I make, what difference is that going to make to anything? And it's the same thing. So stories like you told are an example and an inspiration to us here in Britain, in Mothers Union, in the rest of the Christian Church, anybody that wants to make a change in the world, not just us. But, hold that up as an inspiration, because a lot of little things put together will add up to significant change that everybody can see, won't they? That's my belief anyway. I think it's all our beliefs.
This morning I attended a Melanesian committee meeting, the Link committee meeting, and they were talking about the same thing, that, women go around with their heads bowed in Melanesia, Solomon Islands, because that's what you do, instead of holding your head upright. And also because of the COVID thing, although they haven't really got a huge amount, there's more domestic violence because of people drinking more alcohol and drugs. And, sort of as a committee, we were chatting about it and said, well, actually, the way forward is to maybe help with the parenting. So the Mothers Union could actually do the parenting course, which I think they did before over there. And maybe that's the way forward to ask Mary Sumner House, whether they're still doing that course in a lot of countries, because it would stop the abuse to a certain extent. So it's interesting.
I think that what I think always makes me feel a little bit sad is the fact that we've got an awful lot of this here. And we talk about parenting, and we're talking about domestic violence and all this and the things like that. And we've got a lot to look at in this country. It shouldn't stop us looking to see what's happening elsewhere. But it's very easy to say about culture and all these other things, but we need to have a look at what's happening here in, good old Buckfast.
I think anything that reminds us that there is a diversity out there and that we don't speak for everyone. And actually, we're a very small country, and in fact, small community. And I think the issues that everyone around the world are facing about challenging the norm, challenging bias. I'd love it, Janet, use the caste system to talk about Buckfast, because actually we do have our own caste system, the class system.
Yeah.
And we've had all this stuff more recently about racism and unconscious bias. Actually, the challenges are just because we've got, houses that maybe don't leak, or access to electricity doesn't make us any more developed in a lot of different ways. So I think anything from each of our experiences that reminds us that there is work to be done, and particularly in the areas of empathy and equality, and seeing those people who are oppressed because of the colour of their skin or because of their gender or sexuality. I think if we can be aware of that, then we are doing the work of the kingdom. We are doing the missionary work we need to be doing on our doorstep, because it is a global challenge.